You're good to go.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending here tonight. My name is Chad Frankie. I'm the president of Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. As president of Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, of course, I sit on the board of directors as the chair. Uh, the role of the board is one of the roles is governance. We have the responsibility to ensure that bylaws are followed by the organization and also that the organization follows the laws set forth by the state of Colorado, as we are a Colorado organization, is how we are organized. In doing some reviews, Jenny Lamb Rogers, our legal counsel, has advised us that it is time to take a look at our bylaws. There's some specific provisions that should be in there that aren't, and there are some stuff in there that probably shouldn't be from a legal perspective. Since we are also a member-driven organization and our bylaws lay out not just the legal side of the organization, but the operational side as well. And we have also had a couple of county chapters reach out and say they'd like to talk about some of those operational parts of the bylaws. We started this process. Jenny has completed a legal review and we'll go over some of her recommendations tonight. In accordance with the bylaws, of course, our members have to vote on those bylaws. Jenny will go over that a little bit. And then we've got some proposals that came from some members or some chapters, and Jenny will go over those. And then at the end, there'll be a little bit of a chance for question and answer. If you've got questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat. At the appropriate time, Tyler will let us know that there's a question and we'll do our best to answer them. And at the end, we'll let you guys know about a survey we're going to put out to gather some more information. This is the first step of the process, not the end of the process. There's going to be some more reviews leading up to, of course, a submittal deadline for bylaws changes, and then voting at convention. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jenny Lamb Rogers. She's our legal counsel, has been for a number of years, and I will let her take it from here.
Thanks so much, Chad. Really appreciate the introduction. So I'm really glad to be here with you tonight. We are trying something a little bit different for our bylaws review and discussion. Every organization is really governed by kind of two key corporate documents, no matter the organizational type. For the most part, there's the actual articles of incorporation that are filed with the Secretary of State. And then within a certain period of time, depending on how the organization, depending on what type of organization you're organized as, you have to develop bylaws and pass those based on the initial set of directors. And obviously the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union is a very old organization dating back to the early 1900s. So these bylaws have been through a number of different revisions. And additionally, there has been some revisions to the Colorado Cooperative Statute. There's actually two statutes in Colorado for the governance of cooperative associations. There's old Article 55 cooperatives, and then there's Article 56 cooperatives. So we have chosen to be governed by the newer set of cooperative requirements and cooperative regulations set by the state of Colorado, so Article 56. And we'll be talking about some of the laws that shape the governance and how we may want to update the bylaws from a legal perspective. And then I actually think that the main driver for this is that we've also heard a number of member proposals for revising the bylaws. And I think in years of working with the organization since 2018, sometimes the bylaws discussion just becomes one of the items on the agenda at convention, and there isn't the amount of time for the members to really review the proposals, ask questions, and maybe weigh in on how they would like those provisions to reflect kind of the current direction of the organization. So this different approach is a reflection of us trying to have an earlier conversation with the membership about shaping member proposals for the bylaws well in advance of that 60-day before convention deadline before the bylaw proposal has to be submitted. So um, as covered, the bylaws do need some revision. Specifically, members have had several ideas, but our current feedback process doesn't give a lot of time for broad member feedback before a revision is put to vote at convention. So we're trying to move that timeline up and establish a member working group to talk about bylaws and some of these proposals. And then from a legal perspective, some of the mechanisms of meeting, voting, and communication are a bit out of date. And we've talked about some removal of provisions that don't really align with modern corporate practice and just really increase the record-keeping burden for the organization. So let's have a little refresher on the process to actually change the bylaws. As I previously mentioned, proposed amendments from members must be submitted 60 days before convention. This year, that deadline is September 21st, 2026. Then once a proposal for an amendment has been submitted, the board evaluates that proposal and then can present with a recommendation to approve or reject. And that can go forward to convention. And the board can actually reject and not put forward an amendment that would place the union in financial, legal, or administrative jeopardy. Because again, each board member has a fiduciary duty to the organization to protect our corporate governance. So if a bylaws provision was so detrimental or so extreme that it would actually put the organization in financial, legal, or administrative jeopardy if passed, the board can reject that proposed revision from the members. Proposed amendments must be distributed to the membership 30 days before convention. And then to actually pass a convention, bylaws do not require a simple majority vote, but actually a 2/3 vote to amend the bylaws at convention. And again, if you have any questions about process or anything that kind of comes up as we go along, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. So our goals for tonight are first to present and discuss some of these member ideas. I'm envisioning that we'll probably spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes on the 3 main member ideas that have been put forward so far. And then we'll take the Q&A kind of live in that session and answer your questions as they come up as we're discussing those 3 different member proposals. Then we'll go through some of the council suggested provisions that are revisions for kind of aligning our bylaws with more modern corporate practice. And then finally, we'll provide information about how to engage further with the discussions about RMFU governance by applying to join the member bylaws working group. So let's get started with those member proposals. So before we dive into the member proposals, I do want to give a refresher on the difference between the officers and directors in the RMFU organization as set out by the bylaws. So specifically, our bylaws allow for not less than 5 and no more than 15 directors. And those directors are based on the number of districts established by the board. A director has to currently be resident of the district for which they are elected. Directors are elected by all of the delegates at the annual convention for a 3-year term. And one of the specific bylaws provisions is that there must be an odd number of directors. So if you do have any proposal to change change the number of directors by like 1, for instance, then there has to be some action to ensure that we don't end up with an even number of directors. So there has to be a simultaneous action to ensure that we're always at an odd number. And there are a number of provisions under the bylaws that allow the board to step in to take action, such as a redistricting to ensure that there is an odd number of directors. And the reason for an odd number of directors is that you never want to be in a position where there's a vote on something and there's a tie. So that's the reason for the odd number of directors on a board, and it's a very standard corporate practice. In addition to what we call directors under the bylaws, there are officers, and there are only two delegate elected officer positions in the bylaws as they currently stand. And those are the president and the vice president. And they are each elected by all the delegates at annual convention for a 3-year term. The presidents and vice president may be a resident of any district, and they actually serve as additional members of the board of directors. So they count toward that odd number of directors on the board. And currently there are 9 directors when you count the president and vice president. There are 2 additional officer positions set out in the bylaws of secretary and treasurer. And these are voted by the board, and elected from the board, but they only serve in that role until the next annual convention. So basically we have the elections at convention. Immediately the next day, there is a board meeting. At that board meeting, one of the important functions of the new board is to elect a secretary and a treasurer from their number. And those individuals will serve in that secretary and treasurer role until the next annual convention. But again, even though those are referred to as officer positions, they come from the board, so they don't count toward that odd number. Are there any questions about that before I move on? Cool. Okay, so member proposal number 1 is that there be term limits for the board of directors and officers. The 2 numbers that have been proposed are a 2-term limit or a 3-term limit for director and officer positions, which may be held consecutively, and each of which carry their own independent limit. So what do I mean by that? I mean that an individual under this proposal could serve for, let's just say that it's 3 terms, could serve for 3 terms as a director, and then decide that they love serving on the board so much that they want to serve as an officer. They could immediately run for the position of vice president or president after serving 3 terms as a director. So, and then once a officer or director has reached their limit, then the proposal is that the director or officer would have to sit out for 1 full election cycle. So that would be, and then could return to the board after that election cycle. Obviously, this is an open proposal. So what we're looking for feedback on from the membership is, well, do we think a 2-term limit or a 3-term limit would be best for the health of the organization? Do we think that these term limits, if proposed, should be put into effect to apply retroactively? So dating back, so if somebody has already maxed out their 3-term director limit, they would not be able to run for that district in the next election. And then a kind of final area for feedback is that this does create a possibility, because we have run into challenges in the past of recruiting directors for certain districts, that it may be that nobody runs for an open board seat. And in such case, if this provision were to go forward, I think we would need to consider, do we want to update the bylaws for allowing for the possibility that no one has run for a district director position. So that's a lot to think about and a lot to digest. Are there any questions?
No questions at this time in the Q&A. If they come in, I'll let you know.
Sure. Chad, would you like to weigh in on your views about any of those?
Oh, if we can pause real quick. Actually, we did just say that we need more time for question. Yes.
Oh,
And
no problem.
please feel free to also put your question in at any point, and we can pause. But yeah, we'll pause here. I think someone's typing a question, so if we'll just pause for a second.
Yeah, I thank you for the feedback. Yes, Jenna, we will make sure that you have a copy of the slides, and the recording for this will be distributed afterwards along with a survey to join
Yeah.
the member bylaws working group. So,
And then there's a second question. Is there another proposal for term limits? So far, we've only received one proposal from one chapter. That doesn't mean that there may not be more proposals coming in.
mhm. And again, the
And the member
proposal
work
is
group,
kind of
yeah,
loosely defined at this point, could be a 2 or 3 term limit. So I think this is the opportunity to shape this proposal into what the members think it should be and want to ultimately put forward.
exactly. And we will be, just so everyone knows, we will be sharing the slides and the recording for everyone that's on. Jenny will announce this again later, but we'll also distribute a survey to determine who wants to be on here. If you would like to submit a proposal, Chad, did the proposals come to you or to Jenny? And we have
Um,
you can submit them via email by September 21st, but also we'll have the member work group where we're hoping we can get a lot of people to answer a lot of these questions and work
Yeah,
through some
so
things.
maybe it's best to pause for just a second and talk about the process. We were going to talk about that a little bit more at the end. But we've mentioned in passing, we are going to create a members working group to work through these proposals to gather input, and flesh out, does it need to be a 2-term or a 3-term limit? What does it look like retroactive or going forward? And also to gather feedback, are there any other proposals that we haven't heard about yet? This working group, I will task with meeting with Jenny Lamb Rogers, because this is a legal document, so we need to make sure that the wording is crafted correctly. And then those members are also going to be tasked with getting out to the members with assistance from the organization and assistance from myself, to gather that feedback. And so that is where we want to start with those proposals, because we want to make sure we don't end up with 2 competing proposals that do not mesh well together. That could be a legal quagmire.
Mhm.
So since it looks like we're going to have a number of proposals together, I want to task that working group with pulling those together, and then ideally that working group will submit however many proposals they come up with from the membership, to the board prior to that September 21st date.
Exactly.
There's a few other questions. So one is, how does a member join the work group? We will be sending out a survey afterwards that we will also send out put out on the website and socials that allow members to fill out the survey after watching the presentation to determine, and they're self-nominate. So it's a self-nomination to join the working group. Hope that answers that question. What are the current restrictions on directors' terms? Currently, we do not have term limits in the organization at all. Another question is, if passed, would bylaws go into effect at the 2026 or 2027 convention? If they were passed at the 2026 convention, Jenny will be working on this with the work group, but those will go into effect for the well, it depends on which one. So like this one here, the term limits, that would start with the 2027 convention. And then how will they
But again,
interface?
like that could be part of the discussion with this group of when should these go into effect.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we would be looking for feedback on. And that's part of this is you get a member proposal, but it's not a complete idea that really truly works legally yet. So we need to kind of iron out the details and make sure it actually meshes into the bylaws. So if you're really interested in this question, then the then please express that in the survey and ask to join that working group. But I think my initial view is that this is something that would probably go into effect for the 2027 convention if this was adopted, just like you said, Tyler.
Yep. And then there's how will they interface with other members? One thing to remind is that we will do additional webinars as well as in-person meetings around the three-state region as this progresses through. So we'll hold additional webinars after some of the meetings, and then we'll also host some live meetings. We'll work with the board directors to find out where we should host those in their districts. Did have someone ask if there's a way to see other people's questions. I'm happy to answer those. Since this is an open link, what we've done is we've not made it where everything is live, just so we don't have like a Zoom bomb situation, or people posting things that shouldn't be posted. And then I'll let Chad answer the last question, which is who selects the work group participants from the nominees?
So in the bylaws, it gives the president the power to create committees. So the bylaws give me that power. I'm taking feedback from the other board members. Of course, as Tyler said, a survey will be sent out after this. And one of those questions is, do you want to be one of those? And that is the place to put your name in. I'm going to try and create the working group in such a way that we have people spread out geographically. And also with some thought to the situation of those people. It is going to be a bit of a time commitment, so I will reach out and make sure that people have the commitment. And as far as how they're going to interact with members, that's largely going to depend on who's on that group. As Tyler said, webinars and in person, but we want to make sure that it works for the people who are giving their time to the organization.
And I do anticipate if you're thinking about this for yourself and like your time demands, I would anticipate most of the like meetings with me would not require in-person participation. It would probably be a lot more Zoom calls where we would put up a proposal and I can like live edit the language based on feedback from the committee there. So that's more what that would look like. And then I would expect that probably some of those members would go to some of those in-person meetings, but you wouldn't be expected to go to every in-person event. So, any more questions about that?
Someone said, can someone serve as a member of the policy committee?
Will the meetings be during normal business hours? I probably would want to put them in the evenings. To accommodate for having, I think they'd probably be more likely to be in the evenings. So, but we could do a mix of normal business hours and in the evenings at the pleasure of the group.
To address the question, should a member or could a member serve as a member of the policy committee and the bylaws committee? I see no reason you couldn't. Bylaws committee by definition is the board of directors. The bylaws working group, their work will largely be done by September 21st, other than some time helping to spread the word of those proposals.
It's a great question. Are there any more questions about this specific proposal that you'd like to ask before we move to the second proposal? I'll try and give a minute here so that we don't move on too quickly. And I'm just scrolling back to see if there's anything that we missed. I think we're good. Okay, so let's go to the next proposal. The next proposal is to add an additional elected officer position. And the proposal from members has been for an additional office of secretary. So as we reviewed previously, currently the secretary is elected from the board and not by the membership, and is not an additional member of the board. The bylaws would need to be amended to add an officer position. But as I mentioned earlier, if we added an officer position, then some action would need to be taken by the board to adjust for the change that would happen of creating a situation where there would be an even number of directors immediately after that bylaw change goes into effect. Fortunately, the board doesn't, and this is one of the ways that the bylaws are well designed currently, there isn't a bylaws amendment needed for the board to take that action. So the kind of two paths that the board would have to follow if an amendment were to pass to say, in the 2027 annual meeting of the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, there will be an election for an additional elected officer position from the delegates of secretary. That the board would see that coming into effect at the end of this 2026 meeting, and they would have to decide, A, if they're going to redistrict and change the number of directors as of the next at the next annual meeting election. So how that would largely be done is that the districts would be redrawn, and then typically one of the director positions would be eliminated, and then you would still be able to preserve that even number. The other way that the board could act is there's also a power under the bylaws for the board to create a director at large position without having to redistrict in order to continue to preserve an odd number. So that would push the size of the board then up to 11 seats. And there are economic considerations and governance considerations when you have a larger board, and most of the board meetings are in person. You're talking about budgeting for the travel for 2 additional individuals. All of those things would be considered by the board in terms of the overall financial health of the organization and how well the board actually operates together. And is 11 going to be such a large number that you will have a less productive conversation or feedback? So with this proposal, I think the membership needs to be aware that it wouldn't just be the addition of an elected officer. It's that the board would then have to take action either to redistrict or to add an additional director at large position. That one's a bit complex. So are there questions about this proposal?
I do see one question. Is there historical context for why the secretary position is not actually appointed elected by the board from the board members and not elected by the members? This gets back to history of the organization. It's actually the secretary and treasurer currently are elected by the board from the board members. We've got some longtime members who may strike me down for my thoughts on why this is. Our current structure where the president is the chairman and is not a full-time employee of the board actually changed about 20 years ago or so. That was the last major change to the operational side of the bylaws. The president used to be the position that Tyler now fulfills. The executive director of the organization and the president were one and the same. Because of that, they could not be the chairman of the board. So the president chairman was split. If you go back even farther, You go back 70 years, this organization was a volunteer organization. 100%. The people on the board were the ones doing the day-to-day, similar to how our chapters are structured now. We're a much more mature organization now, a much different organization. And so the reason the secretary and treasurer are the way they are is probably just an artifact of what we grew out of. Um, I will also say that largely secretary and treasurer are, especially the secretary, is more of a ceremonial type position. We have a recording secretary that typically does all of the recording of the minutes of our meetings. So the secretary is not the one scribing the notes. They are responsible for making sure those minutes are done correctly and providing the reports to the members. But it's not a significant change from any other position on the board.
And if I may add, I think the motivation for this proposal was more to have another opportunity for individuals with leadership talent to serve on the board in a director position, but not necessarily to have to come from a highly competitive district or a district where they felt like the likelihood that a person would be elected is low because of either a really strong board member or other reasons. So, and also that the position of vice president and president may not be the best fit for personalities that still would like to be in a leadership position with the organization. In that, at this point in time, a large set of the roles and responsibilities for the vice president of the organization as set by organizational policy is for the actual policy committee chair position. And the president has a very strong role in the organization of having a lot of external kind of speaking engagements and public relations role within the organization. So that was my understanding of kind of the motivation for maybe why there's another elected officer position. So I take that with a grain of salt and what you will, and we can certainly talk about kind of more pros and cons for adding an elected officer position in that working group type session.
And one other thing of adding an additional officer position, that will then make one officer position, one at-large position available for election every year. Currently, there's 1 year that it skips.
I'm looking at the next question. Is the board's function as mostly meeting in person a bylaws provision? It seems a greater hardship the farther from Denver one is for mostly in-person meeting policy. There's actually a proposal that's put forward under the legal section to specifically allow for remote meetings on the board. So I'll cover that a little bit later for that question. And then, so if you can be patient for kind of exploring that a little further. And then, did the chapter provide the reason for the additional position? Okay, I already answered that question. Okay. Any additional questions?
One last thing before we get started back on the presentation is if you have shared the link with someone else when you joined, it may have, when someone signs in, it may show up as your name. So everyone who's on as a participant, if you wouldn't mind just checking your name, and if it is not yours, if you'll change your name to your correct name, so we can make sure to know that. And had a few people reach out saying that some questions are coming in under their name that they didn't submit. So
thanks, Tyler. Okay, so for the last member proposal, was a proposal that only members of the district may elect their district director. And so I think this one is probably the simplest of the three, but basically that we would reorganize the election day so that When there's an election for directors, it would only be the individuals from, that portion of New Mexico that's represented by the New Mexico district director voting for that director, instead of the organization at large voting for, or the delegates from the organization at large voting for that director position. In practice, this will require redistricting because there is a lot of disparity in population of member numbers between the districts. And I think, Chad, I think you put that together a little bit. Do you want to share kind of rough numbers to give the members an idea?
Yeah, to give an idea, from the least member heavy district to the most heavy district is a factor of 10. And we should also add that in the bylaws, redistricting is a role of the board of directors, and I believe we may be overdue. So we need to probably look at redistricting, whether this proposal comes to fruition or not.
Are there any questions for this? Oh, Todd.
There's not one on this one, but there is a question. Yeah, the secretary position. So it says, if the secretary position is added, the board of directors could alternatively add the treasurer as an officer instead of an at-large position, correct? To keep the numbers, the number of members odd.
No. The only mechanisms that are currently provided under the bylaws from my reading is to add the director at large position or to redistrict.
And eliminate one of the districts.
Yeah, and in redistricting, eliminate one district. So to create an additional officer position, whether that be secretary or treasurer, or you wanted to call it something else, you would need an amendment to the bylaws. Any other questions on member proposal 3 or 2 or any of those before we move into kind of the more legal, like modernization type proposals? And it's also totally fine if you have a question that kind of comes up later. We can always go back and address that question when we get into the modernization. It looks like
there is a question here.
Is there a set process for redistricting, or is it discretionary? Redistricting is in the discretion of the board, and the bylaws provision basically says from time to time the board of directors should consider redistricting or the allocation of the districts, so to meet the changing needs of the organization or something to that effect. So totally in the discretion of the directors on the board.
And it looks like answering the question about there's no way to see myself or my name, it looks like, because like as hosts we can see all the people on, but you may not be able to see your name or anyone else's. I'm not quite sure how to resolve this, other than in the future we just can't share the link, but I don't know how to resolve that at this time. I apologize.
Okay. Feedback for the future. Okay, so on to the modernization proposals. The first modernization proposal hits on that question from earlier about allowing a virtual option for board meetings. Currently, the bylaws are silent on this, but the implication is probably that they are in person. So the proposed revision would be to Article 5, Section 2 to make a virtual option explicitly allowed. And the motivation behind that being making membership and participation on the board of directors more accessible to members with high leadership potential. The board currently meets quarterly, and we wouldn't probably obligate the board to meet remotely every time, but the board could meet and discuss and decide what number of board meetings they would want to have be remote once this type of bylaws provision was passed. So I think this is something that follows, well, I don't think, I know this is something that follows most modern corporate practice. It is very rare to have a requirement for in-person meetings for the board anymore. Most corporate board meetings are held virtually by companies globally. So I think this would just be a step to kind of move the organization more toward modern practice. The next, oh gosh, I don't know why it's skipping. Yeah, the next proposal is to authorize the board to hold a remote convention. And this would explicitly allow the board to hold a remote convention upon a finding of good cause and a majority vote of the directors. I'm sure the immediate circumstance that comes to mind is something like the COVID pandemic occurring again. We ultimately didn't have time to do a bylaws revision or and basically had a corporate action at that point under force majeure was the legal rationale to allow us to hold a remote annual meeting. But the better practice would be that to give the board of directors that discretion should something like that happen again. And the legal threshold of a finding of good cause is a relatively high one, and to require a majority vote of the directors. So I think this is a relatively uncontroversial provision, and overall kind of protects the organization to say that we still, to give us a way of carrying out the business of the organization should another circumstance arise like the pandemic again. The next revision would be to update the technologies for notice. Currently, the document references telegraph and teletype as mechanisms for notice. And we would update this to allow for email, text, or even potentially like a portal notification. So if there's like a shared like Dropbox, that kind of thing that the board decides to adopt. Right now, we're pretty like limited on the technologies for communication by the bylaws, but this would really let the organization kind of move into this century for being able to have notice of board meetings and for those formal communications. The next requirement is, or the next proposal would be to remove the requirement for custody and physical affixing of the corporate seal to records of the RMFU. This increases the paperwork and documentary burden and is a pretty outdated practice. It's not required by Colorado law, and I think this is probably something that's just been carried forward through various bylaws revisions. So there isn't a good way of, or there isn't really a reason for it anymore, and we should just not require it as part of our practice. Last, and then another proposal, and this one I think may elicit more discussion and conversation, would be to authorize electronic voting from the convention floor. And this one has been mentioned by members in the past, but it wasn't really put forward by any chapter and is in here. I see it as more of a modernization of corporate practice, but so this group knows there have been many members who have raised this in the past of could we start doing this, but not in the sense of like a true kind of formal member proposal that we've received. And what we would propose here is to explicitly allow for secure electronic clickers, keypads at voting, or electronic voting machines from the convention floor. we would I would suggest that this be drafted in a relatively open way to allow the board of directors some discretion in being able to evaluate the cost of different technologies and the effectiveness of different technologies. We have discussed some prior to this meeting that we would still want a secret ballot, and so that you don't have to like publicly vote, and that we wouldn't want the bylaws to be revised that you could only vote through electronic means. So if there was a mass technology failure, there could still be an opportunity to permit paper voting to allow like the convention to continue. And we also discussed that meeting in person for our annual convention still is a very important part of the RMFU community and spirit of the organization. So this revision would still maintain the requirement that a delegate be properly registered and physically present in order to cast their vote. So I know there have to be questions about this provision. So would love to hear some feedback and thoughts.
And Jenny, there is one question about the modernization proposals, if you wouldn't mind looking at that one.
For the most part, these are from me reviewing the bylaws as an attorney who has been practicing corporate law for 10 years. But like I mentioned with this one particularly, it's been mentioned by members to me of like, why don't we have electronic voting? But again, not in the same sense of those 3 previous member proposals of, we would like to see this change, and specifically coming from a chapter putting forward a proposal. So hopefully that clarifies the question.
And to be clear on this electronic voting one, it would not be allowed per our current bylaws. We need a bylaws change in order to implement electronic voting.
Yes, exactly. Because what is currently in the bylaws is a written secret ballot. Any more questions about this one? Okay. Then the last one is, and this is a proposal from me, based on a review of again, modern corporate practice, is that there is currently no provision in the bylaws to allow for removal of officers or directors. And this is very unusual in corporate practice, because there are reasons that you would want to remove a director from an organization. An example, and the leading examples would be that an officer or director fails to abide by their duty of care or their duty of loyalty. An example, or the director or officer could commit a malfeasance that is so severe that reflects very poorly on the organization, such as the officer or director being convicted of a felony. So here is kind of the Colorado cooperative statute. When you don't have a provision in the bylaws, the option for removal of directors is extremely limited. And it basically says the bylaws or by members only for cause unless otherwise provided by the bylaws and brought by a signed petition of 10% of the members delivered to the board of directors. And then within 90 days, the board has to call a meeting to review and have a vote on those removal petitions. Practically, for our organization, getting a signed petition of 10% of the members to remove an officer or director would be extremely hard to do, because we grant membership to anyone who purchases insurance through FUSA. So the membership is so much larger than our participation at convention. So getting a signed petition for 10% of the membership would be a monumental task for any member to take on. And then under the Colorado cooperative statute, directors can only remove those who don't meet the qualification for directors as defined in the bylaws. And currently, our bylaws say this is simply being a member in good standing for 3 years. Current qualifications also limit. So basically, what does that leave us with? The only way to remove a director from the board is really to exercise what I would call a pretty nuclear option of removing a director by expelling someone from the RMFU membership. And there is a process within the bylaws to expel someone from the RMFU membership, but it is much more difficult to do than is commonly found in modern corporate practice. And then I added the last kind of provision here for when from the actual cooperative statute that the director subject to removal does have to be informed in writing by the board and has to have the opportunity to be heard. And this is in keeping with the constitutional right of due process. So basically, once you have a right in something, that right can't be taken from you without notice of the right being of the reason for why the right is being taken from you and an opportunity to be heard. And the Colorado statute also specifically provides for being able to be heard by appearing for yourself or by appearing through counsel. So. And then the other mechanism for removal of a director under the Colorado revised statutes is to have a judicial proceeding for the removal of a director. But obviously that is expensive and time consuming, and there could be significant damage done to the organization in the time it takes to do a judicial proceeding. And if a member petition process is so difficult to implement with an organization that's designed the way we are. So with that, what I would propose is a much more standard removal mechanism for removal by the board. And that would be adding language to the effect of a director fails to meet qualifications of a director if they're convicted of a felony, if they fail to attend 3 consecutive meetings of the board, unless 1 or more absences are explicitly excused by a majority vote of the directors. And I think having that safety valve in there of the absences being excused is very important. There are things that happen in people's lives that shouldn't it shouldn't become an automatic thing that if a director misses 3 consecutive meetings, they have to be removed from the board. The board should have the ability to operate, to exercise their discretion and to keep someone on the board. So in the example of an extreme illness or an emergency or something like that, the board should be able to keep someone with great leadership potential and that contributes to the board as one of the membership, even if they missed 3 meetings in a row. And then the last piece, this comes from like standard corporate practice again, is that if the officer or director were in material breach of RMFU policies or procedures or the conflict of interest policy adopted by the board of directors. And a material breach would have to be a written finding of clear evidence that this person violated their duty of loyalty. So a conflict of interest would be, most of the time, one that would rise to this level would be that they were actually interested and didn't disclose that they were going to make money off of a transaction that was voted on and approved by the board of directors or something like that. So happy to take any questions on that kind of set of proposals.
And Jenny, you have one on whether or not the terms of duty and care or duty of loyalty are clearly defined, saying that they're not familiar with the terms.
Yeah, great question. So duty of care, these are actually like legal terms that are defined for the fiduciary duty of officers and directors within statute and within case law in Colorado. So whenever a person becomes a director for an organization, they take on fiduciary duties, and those two fiduciary duties, the most important of which are the duty of care, which is basically that they have to show up and be diligent in their participation as a board member. There is something in corporate law called the business judgment rule, and you can make incredibly stupid decisions and objectively stupid decisions, but as long as you showed up and you made the decisions diligently, it's very hard for a court to kind of second guess you under the duty of care. And the duty of loyalty largely concerns the idea of conflict of interest and preventing, in large part, self-dealing against the organization, so that your son, your daughter isn't receiving a contract and you present that contract to the board of directors so that your family can profit from the organization. So those aren't defined, and that's great feedback for me that I probably should have defined those within this presentation. But those are the core responsibilities of an officer or director of an organization. Okay. And then last, is kind of our time for questions. If you are interested in a further discussion about RMFU governance, we encourage you to take the survey and to provide your written feedback. We are structuring the survey in such a way that each one of these proposals will be its own individual item for feedback. So when you receive like the follow-up email to this webinar, you'll get a copy of the slides. And you'll get this survey. So you'll be able to review everything that's in these slides again as you're providing feedback on the survey. And we'd appreciate your individual kind of specific feedback on each of these proposals. And you certainly don't have to provide feedback on all of them, but anywhere you would like to weigh in, please do so. And then select the option if you would like to join the bylaws working group. And I think our first meeting for that will definitely be within the first 2 weeks of July. And that would be a Zoom meeting. And then we'll probably set another one before the end of the month. And then I would guess 2 more in August before finalizing the member proposals that are going to be put forward in September. So, and then if you decide you don't want to join the bylaws working group, I do anticipate that we'll still have more webinars like this. I will definitely do a webinar to talk about the bylaws proposals before that, like 30-day kind of sharing deadline for what was put forward and recommended by the board to be put forward for vote at convention. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that 30 days before that has to be shared with membership. So we'll do a webinar at that time. And then I think we'll also do another webinar to talk about kind of how these proposals have developed. So I really appreciate your time and attention and care, and happy to answer any additional questions before we close.
Yeah, we have a couple questions on whether or not the survey should go to the entire membership. Yes, that is our goal. And so we will be sending this out tomorrow. But the people who have registered, we do have their email addresses, will be emailing it to you specifically. We will be posting the recording as well as the PowerPoint and survey on our website, and be posting that to socials. I will also work with the communications department on how we get this out to all members. I know we do have some restrictions on emailing every person that is a member of RMFU, all 14,000, but I will work with the communications department to make sure that we get this out as broadly as possible. And then it says that there are folks on this call who won't get that notification. Yeah, we will work on that, and happy to take additional feedback on how we can spread some of this from you if you want to get in contact with me.
And then there is a question of, will the board or legal counsel have other recommendations, or is this the total of the board legal counsel recommendations? As far as legal counsel recommendations, I may always make further recommendations depending on the member proposals that are put forward, so that we're not in conflict with the bylaws. So, and in terms of other proposals from the board, I'm not aware of any other proposals, but the members of the board are also members of the organization. And in reviewing that, any member of the board could also want to put forward a proposal for an amendment to the bylaws by that deadline.
I will add real quick too, again, this is the first step, not the last step of this process. These are the proposals we have heard so far. I anticipate that there will be more. No matter how often we put communication out to our members, there's always somebody that misses the first one or two. So we'll continue that communication. When this recording goes out, it may trigger somebody to come with another proposal. And that's the purpose of that working group. If any board members or any other members want to provide feedback, they'll have that opportunity through that working group.
And also just to say that, if these are the proposals that we know about that the chapters were willing to share with us. Jenny did her legal analysis, but other members may propose things that the work group works on, or there may be proposals that are submitted that just don't even go to the work group, and that's still within reason that anyone can do. It's within our current bylaws that if anyone submits one by the 60 days prior, then it'll be reviewed by the board, and then notice will be sent out to members of the bylaws. So just wanted to say that. So it may or may not go through part of this process. What we're trying to do is make it where there's more member feedback prior to convention, because once it's on the floor, it can't be edited like a policy in the policy book. It's an up or down vote on the bylaw change. We do also have a question of, can staff propose bylaws as members? They are, staff are voting members and are allowed to submit bylaw changes and propose them.
Any member can propose a bylaw change as long as it's before that 60-day deadline. So just as Tyler said, it doesn't have to come through this bylaws working group process. It's just, we had these really meaty proposals start to be surfaced this year, and we wanted to provide a forum for being able to give feedback. And given the import of some of these proposals and the legal implications, we wanted to have a chance for them to be drafted in such a way that by the time they get to the board isn't in a position of feeling like they need to reject a proposal, even if it's a good idea, because it would put the organization in financial jeopardy. Or even say at convention, like, we don't recommend this proposal because of these reasons. Hopefully that by doing the process this way, there's an opportunity to have these proposals be in the best legal shape that we can get them into, so that they have the most likelihood of fair consideration and thoughtful consideration by the membership.
So we've got another question. Will this vote be for all changes or none? Per Robert's rules, it has to be single subject votes. So term limits would be one vote, yes or no. Adding a secretary would be one vote, yes or no. It cannot be a wholesale change because it has to follow the single subject criteria.
Yes, exactly.
And for the person that said, can you say that again? I'm hoping that is that your question? If not, put it in there again on what it's about. But yes, each one would be its own proposed bylaw amendment and be voted on separately.
And I guess Chad said that correctly, that it is single subject. So you could potentially have a change that would require changes in multiple sections, but because the proposal has to work as a whole, it would be presented together. So, you know, that I'm there's lots of places where something is cited in separate sections of the bylaws. And if you do a sweeping change like that, you tackle it by issue and then you cite each place in the bylaws, and then there's an up or down vote on that one. And again, it does require that super majority, that 2/3 vote to actually approve a bylaws change.
And I will remind everybody, our bylaws are available on the website under the About Us tab at the upper right. It's its own section. Just click on the bylaws, and they're there as a PDF if you want to look at them further.
Right. Well, I hope this was helpful and informative, and I really look forward to working with different members as part of that bylaws working group and working on these proposals. Thank you all.